The tactical execution of the military operation spanned merely a few hours, yet the geopolitical reverberations are destined to endure for decades to come. It was originally conceived to be a definitive and surgical maneuver, a clear demonstration of American determination that was intended to resolve the Venezuelan quandary permanently and irrevocably. Aerial strikes were launched with precision against military objectives within Caracas, while specialized tactical teams navigated through the urban landscape. By the conclusion of that fateful Saturday morning, Nicolas Maduro was in custody, confronting federal indictments in New York, and the headlines virtually wrote themselves: Maduro captured, Venezuela operation successful, U.S. removes authoritarian leader. For approximately 72 hours, the narrative unfolded exactly as Washington had envisioned it would. It was presented as a narrative concerning justice, the removal of a dictator, and the restoration of democratic principles. However, an unforeseen development subsequently occurred. The narrative did not simply fade away, but rather it mutated into something entirely different. While American media outlets were debating whether this action was permissible under U.S. domestic law, every government across Latin America was posing a fundamentally distinct question: could we be the next target? That specific inquiry represents the fundamental shift from perceiving the United States as a strategic partner to viewing it as an unpredictable force that might bombard your capital city if you make a policy decision deemed incorrect. That realization is what fundamentally altered the entire landscape. Within a matter of days, the regional response solidified, not through individual statements from isolated nations, but through coordinated condemnation. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay spoke with a unified voice, a phenomenon that does not occur by mere coincidence. Such unity manifests when governments identify a shared existential threat and determine that a collective response is necessary. The United Nations Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela declared that the alleged violations by Maduro's government did not justify a military intervention that breached international law. Multiple nations accused the United States of kidnapping a head of state, of executing a regime change without Security Council authorization, and of violating the foundational principle intended to prevent great powers from invading weaker neighbors. Here is the crucial aspect that most analysts overlooked during those initial days. This situation was not truly about Venezuela. Venezuela served merely as the proof of concept, the demonstration that threats previously regarded as rhetorical were now operational realities. Previously assumed to be pressure tactics that would never actually escalate to kinetic military action, those threats had materialized. Every Latin American leader observing these events understood immediately that the rules of engagement had shifted. The long-standing assumption that guided foreign policy for decades, that aligning with the United States offered economic benefits and security guarantees, was now officially in question. If the United States can take such action against Venezuela over disputes regarding oil and currency policy, what prevents them from doing the same to any nation that makes decisions Washington dislikes? When you are a Latin American government watching this unfold, that question is not theoretical, it is deeply personal. Colombia was not contemplating Venezuela. Colombia was contemplating its own survival. Allow me to demonstrate how this dynamic functions, and how a single operation in one country instantly alters the calculus of every other government in the region. Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, had already been publicly threatened by the Trump administration regarding migration policy. The threat was explicit: manage your borders in the manner we desire, or face the consequences. At that time, most analysts assumed this was typical diplomatic pressure, strong language designed to force negotiation rather than actual policy. Then they witnessed the events in Venezuela. They watched American aircraft strike a neighboring capital. They observed a head of state being arrested and extradited to face charges in New York. They watched the entire operation unfold without Security Council authorization, without regional consultation, and without any of the institutional frameworks that are supposed to constrain the behavior of great powers. Suddenly, Colombia's calculation changed because that threat regarding migration policy was no longer viewed as diplomatic pressure. It was a preview of potential action. Mexico experienced the exact same realization, having been threatened over trade, border security, and drug policy. For years, these threats existed in a space where everyone understood them to be leverage methods, to extract concessions without actual escalation, but Venezuela proved that such a space no longer exists. Panama, which had been dealing with pressure regarding the canal, immediately understood the stakes involved. Cuba, having lived under U.S. pressure for 6 decades, saw confirmation of what they had always known. But now, every other country in the region was seeing it too. This is what security experts refer to as the demonstration effect. You do not need to invade every country. You invade one, and every other country receives the message. Venezuela became the example, the warning, and the proof that when the United States says "or else," the "or else" is now military action. However, here lies the strategic contradiction that American policymakers seem to have missed. When you transform your neighbor into a warning, you do not increase your influence. You increase fear. Fear does not create loyalty. Fear creates hedging. Countries that feel threatened do not move closer to the source of the threat. They search for alternatives. They diversify their relationships, and they build backup plans. In Latin America, that alternative has a name: China. While the United States was demonstrating what happens when you do not comply, China was demonstrating something entirely different. Latin American governments were watching both demonstrations very carefully. The statement was only a few paragraphs long, but it represented something that hasn't happened in Latin America in over a generation. On the surface, it looked like standard diplomatic condemnation. Strong language, expressions of concern, calls for respect of sovereignty and international law. It was the kind of statement that gets issued after every controversial international incident gets reported for a day and then disappears. But this was different. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay didn't issue separate statements from separate foreign ministries expressing separate concerns. They coordinated, they consulted, they drafted joint language, and they released it simultaneously. That level of coordination doesn't happen casually. It requires phone calls, negotiations, agreement on language, agreement on timing, and agreement on the message they wanted to send. The message was clear. We see this as a shared threat, not just Venezuela's problem. Brazil's Lula didn't hedge. He called the operation a grave affront to sovereignty and an extremely dangerous precedent. Those words, extremely dangerous precedent, are not diplomatic boilerplate. That is a warning about future behavior. That is Brazil, the largest economy in South America, telling the United States, "We are watching what you do next, and we are preparing accordingly." Colombia's Petro stated that conflicts should be resolved by people themselves in peace. Mexico explicitly invoked Article 2 of the UN Charter, the prohibition on the use of force against sovereign nations. These aren't small countries making symbolic gestures. These are major regional powers signaling a fundamental reassessment of their relationship with the United States. The joint statement did something that individual protests never could. It created a regional consensus. It established that opposition to the Venezuela operation wasn't about ideology, party politics, or individual leaders. It was a shared Latin American position. That consensus has staying power because once you've publicly coordinated with other governments to condemn American military action, you can't easily walk that back. You've committed. You've aligned yourself with a regional bloc that sees U.S. behavior as a problem that needs to be managed collectively. This is how alliances fracture, not with dramatic breaks or formal declarations, but with quiet coordination among countries that realize they have shared interests that no longer align with the hegemon. For decades, Latin American countries operated mostly independently when it came to the United States. Each country negotiated its own relationship, pursued its own interests, and made its own accommodations. The United States preferred it that way. It is easier to manage bilateral relationships than a coordinated bloc. But the Venezuela operation created something Washington didn't intend: unity, a shared sense that the threat is regional, not individual. And that shared sense is already producing shared responses. While Latin American governments were coordinating their response to American military action, another power was watching, and unlike the United States, this power wasn't threatening anyone. It was building, investing, and offering alternatives, and that contrast is proving decisive. China won Venezuela without deploying a single soldier. They won it with infrastructure loans and long-term contracts, and right now, that strategy looks genius. Let me show you what China did while the United States was preparing military operations. They built ports in Ecuador, railways in Argentina, and power plants in Brazil. They signed long-term trade agreements with Colombia, Peru, and Chile. They offered development loans with clear terms, no political conditions, and payment schedules that stretched decades into the future. They didn't lecture Latin American governments about democracy. They didn't threaten sanctions over internal policies. They didn't demand alignment on foreign policy issues. They showed up with checkbooks, engineering teams, and proposals for projects that Latin American governments actually wanted. And here is the critical part. They were patient. While American policy toward Latin America shifted with every administration, sometimes engagement, sometimes pressure, sometimes neglect, always unpredictable, China maintained consistent economic engagement. The Belt and Road Initiative didn't pause for election cycles. Infrastructure projects didn't get canceled because of domestic political drama in Beijing. The relationship was stable, predictable, and transactional. Then Venezuela happened, and suddenly every decision China had made over the past 15 years looked strategically brilliant. When Latin American governments watched the United States bomb Caracas and then looked at their relationship with China, they saw this contrast. China builds infrastructure in their countries. The United States bombs their neighbors. China offers long-term trade deals. The United States threatens tariffs and sanctions. China doesn't care about their internal governance. The United States demands political alignment. Most importantly, China has never invaded a country in Latin America. The United States just did. Beijing didn't have to make this argument explicitly. The contrast made the argument for them. All China had to do was issue a statement condemning the operation as a violation of international law, calling for dialogue and respect for sovereignty, and positioning itself as the defender of the principles the United States was violating. This is what strategic patience looks like. China spent 15 years building economic relationships, not because they expected the United States to invade Venezuela, but because they understood that eventually, American coercion would create opportunities for alternatives. They understood that if you're patient, if you're consistent, if you don't threaten people, eventually the aggressive actor makes mistakes. And when those mistakes happen, the patient actor doesn't need to do anything dramatic. They just need to be there, offering stability while the alternative offers chaos. This isn't about morality. China has its own record of coercion and control. But in this specific contest, in this specific region, at this specific moment, China positioned itself as the stable partner, while the United States looked unpredictable and aggressive. And that positioning matters because Latin American governments aren't making moral judgments, they're making strategic calculations. And those calculations increasingly favor the partner who offers predictability over the partner who offers power backed by threats. Latin America isn't choosing China because China is better. They're choosing China because China is more predictable. And in international relations, predictability is everything. Let me explain how governments actually make decisions about economic partnerships and strategic alignment. It's not about ideology. It's not about which system is more just or which country has better values. It's about this question. If we tie our economy to this partner, what are the risks that the relationship suddenly becomes a liability? With the United States, that risk calculation has changed dramatically. American policy can shift completely with a single election. A trade agreement signed by one administration can be abandoned by the next. Economic engagement can turn into sanctions if domestic American politics demand it. And now, as Venezuela proves, policy disagreements can escalate to military action. You're a Latin American finance minister trying to plan economic development for the next decade. You're considering two options. Option A, Chinese infrastructure loan, fixed interest rate, 20-year repayment schedule, no political conditions. The terms are clear, the timeline is predictable, and based on 15 years of evidence, China will honor the agreement regardless of what happens in their domestic politics or what policies your government pursues. Option B, American Economic Partnership. Potentially better terms, access to the world's largest economy, but the relationship depends on maintaining political alignment. It can be disrupted by American domestic politics. It comes with demands about your internal governance. And if Washington decides your policies are problematic, you might face sanctions or worse. Which option do you choose? This is why Chinese lending in Latin America has exploded over the past decade. It's not because Latin American governments love the Chinese system. It's because they can plan around it. When China signs a contract to build a port, the port gets built. When China commits to buying commodities, they buy commodities. When they say a loan has 20-year terms, it has 20-year terms. The relationship is transactional, but transactions are predictable. Meanwhile, the United States offers access to larger markets, better technology, stronger security guarantees, all of which come with strings attached. And increasingly, those strings look like ropes that might be used to hang you if American priorities shift. This is the strategic failure American policymakers don't seem to understand. They assume that economic and military power would be enough to maintain dominance. They assume that countries would accept unpredictability because they had no choice. But countries always have choices, and when one partner offers power with unpredictability and another offers stability with consistency, more and more countries are choosing stability. It's not that they trust China more than America, it's that they can predict China more reliably than America. And in a world where your economic development plans span decades, predictability is worth more than power. The Venezuela operation accelerated this calculation because it proved that American unpredictability isn't just about trade policy or diplomatic pressure. It extends to military force. And once that line is crossed, once countries understand that alignment with the United States comes with the risk that they might be the next target, the entire relationship changes. Because Venezuela wasn't the first time Latin America has dealt with American pressure. The region has lived through coups, invasions, interventions, and economic warfare for over a century. But what makes this moment different is that now, for the first time, there's a viable alternative. And that alternative is actively offering what the United States is no longer providing: predictability. The threats to Colombia, Mexico, Panama, and Cuba weren't random. They were testing the boundaries. Venezuela proved there are no boundaries left. Let me walk you through the pattern that every Latin American government is now analyzing. Colombia gets threatened over migration policy. The message: manage your borders the way we want, or face consequences. Mexico gets threatened over trade and fentanyl flows. The message: align with our security priorities, or we'll use economic pressure. Panama gets threatened over the canal. The message: we still consider this strategic infrastructure, and will intervene if we feel it's necessary. Cuba faces ongoing pressure over everything. Cuba has always been the example of what happens when you refuse American demands. For months, these threats existed in a space where everyone understood they were leverage ways to extract concessions, pressure tactics designed to force negotiations. Nobody seriously believed they would escalate to military action because military action in Latin America was supposed to be a relic of the Cold War. Then Venezuela happened, and suddenly, every threat previously dismissed as rhetorical became operational. Every warning previously understood as negotiating tactics became a preview of actual policy. Colombia's government immediately understood they weren't just watching Venezuela's problem, they were watching their own future if they didn't comply with American demands on migration. Mexico understood that the threats over border security weren't going to stay in the realm of trade negotiations and diplomatic pressure. Panama understood that American interest in the canal wasn't historical nostalgia, it was active strategic planning. And every other country in the region understood that the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old assertion that Latin America is within the American sphere of influence, that doctrine isn't a historical artifact. It's current operational policy backed by willingness to use military force. This is what hegemonic overreach looks like. The United States didn't just remove Maduro, they removed the assumption that there were limits to American intervention in the hemisphere. For decades, even during the worst periods of American involvement in Latin America, there were certain lines. You didn't conduct open military operations against a sitting government. You worked through proxies, through coups, through economic pressure. There was at least a pretense of respecting sovereignty. Venezuela ended that pretense. And once that pretense is gone, once countries understand that the United States will bomb a capital city if diplomatic and economic pressure don't work, the entire security calculus of the region changes. Countries start preparing for the possibility that they might be next. They diversify their military suppliers. They build economic relationships that don't depend on American approval. They coordinate with other countries facing similar pressures. They stop thinking about the United States as a partner and start thinking about the United States as a threat that needs to be managed. Because this pattern threaten, pressure, escalate to force, this isn't just changing how Latin America sees the United States right now. It's changing how they plan their future. And that future increasingly doesn't include American leadership. It includes American power that needs to be hedged against. Trust takes decades to build and days to destroy. The Venezuela operation accomplished the destruction in less than a week. Here's what American policymakers don't seem to understand about trust in international relations. Once it's gone, it doesn't come back with policy changes or diplomatic apologies or shifts in administration, because trust isn't about what you say. It's about what you've proven you're capable of doing. And what the United States proved in Venezuela is that when economic pressure doesn't work, military force follows. That diplomatic engagement is conditional. That sovereignty is respected only when convenient. That international law applies to everyone except Washington. You can't unprove that. You can't reverse the demonstration. Every Latin American government now knows what the United States is willing to do. And that knowledge changes everything. Brazilian policymakers planning economic development for the next 20 years now include the variable, what if American priorities shift and we become a target? Colombian strategists negotiating migration policy now operate with the understanding, we're not negotiating with a partner, we're managing a threat. Mexican officials managing border security now operate with the understanding, we're not negotiating with a partner, we're managing a threat. This is already producing concrete policy shifts. Latin American countries are accelerating economic integration with China, not because they prefer China, but because China offers an alternative that doesn't come with the risk of military intervention. They're coordinating diplomatic positions in ways they haven't in decades. The joint statement on Venezuela was just the beginning. They're diversifying their military suppliers, their trade relationships, their financial systems. They're building redundancy into every strategic relationship to ensure that American pressure can't cripple them. And, most significantly, they're changing how they talk about the United States internally, not as the leader of the free world, not as the defender of democracy, as a great power that uses force when softer methods fail. The tragedy of this moment is that it was entirely avoidable. The United States had enormous goodwill in Latin America, built over decades of economic engagement, democratic cooperation, and cultural exchange. That goodwill is now gone, replaced by fear, calculation, and the search for alternatives, and the strategic consequences will compound over time. Because when countries don't trust you, they don't just avoid current cooperation, they avoid future cooperation. They build their plans around the assumption that you can't be relied upon. Every infrastructure project that goes to Chinese firms instead of American companies, every trade agreement negotiated with Asian partners instead of North American ones, every strategic decision made with the assumption that the United States might be hostile rather than helpful. These aren't reversible with a change in administration or a shift in rhetoric. These are structural changes that will shape Latin America's relationship with the United States for the next generation. The Venezuela operation might have achieved its immediate objective. Maduro is in custody. The legal process is underway. American-friendly structures might eventually control Venezuelan oil. But strategically, the cost is catastrophic. Because the United States didn't just lose Latin America's trust, it proved to the entire world that coercion has replaced persuasion as the primary tool of American power. And when that's your brand, when countries see you as the power that threatens rather than the power that partners, you don't lead, you dominate. And domination creates resistance. China understands this. They're watching every move, offering alternatives, building relationships, and being patient. Russia understands this. They're calculating what they can get away with in their sphere of influence if the United States has normalized military intervention, and every other country in the world understands this. They're watching what happened to Venezuela and asking, how do we make sure we're not next? The answer to that question won't strengthen American power. It will fragment it. History won't remember this operation as the moment the United States removed a dictator. It will remember it as the moment Latin America stopped trusting American restraint and started building a future that doesn't depend on American approval. That shift is irreversible, and it's already begun.